Hello, my name's Rick Sheffer. Genealogy is about going backward in time in order to bring forward the rich history of our family's past. This is the story of my Sheffer family, who immigrated from Germany to America around 1770 and lived in two defined regions of Pennsylvania for the next 200 years. I imagine my story is similar to literally thousands of families over the years. I hope you enjoy it. To give some perspective to the geography of my talk, here's a map of Pennsylvania. The Sheffer's journey in America started in Philadelphia, moved to Westmoreland County in southwestern Pennsylvania, and then to Venango County in the northwestern part of the state. Here the Sheffer German clan congregated for the next 150 years when the recent family diaspora began. This is a view of the rolling hills that dominate the terrain in western Pennsylvania. The picture to the right is the Interstate 80 bridge over the Allegheny River. I grew up in the town of Emlenton, located next to this bridge. This is a satellite view of the oil region. Just above where the Clarion River meets the Allegheny River is Emlenton. Further up the Allegheny is the city of Franklin and Oil City, and far north is the city of Warren, Pennsylvania. The Warren area will be important when I discuss my Sheffer's relatives' role in the Revolutionary War. Finally, this is a close-up map of Venango County, where the story of Pennsylvania oil took shape. The town of Titusville is located at the top center of Venango County. 27 miles south of Titusville, along the Allegheny River, is Oil City. The green area shows the Oil Creek area running between Titusville and Oil City. This has been called the black gold region of the early oil industry. And at the very right-hand corner of the county is a little town called Emlenton. As I mentioned, this is the area where I grew up, as did my father, grandfather, great-grandfather, and great-great-grandfather, who came to this area in 1822. My presentation tonight will cover 5 generations of the Sheffer family, starting in Germany in the late 1760s and ending roughly in the 1970s. Over 10 years ago, I drew this simple graphic to try and map out my curiosity about one family's generational journey through time. A journey taken across the ocean to America, across the Allegheny Mountains to Westmoreland County, and finally north to what was then Venango County. Roughly halfway through that journey, the Sheffers engaged in the Pennsylvania oil industry and were continuously engaged through the 1960s. My family story today begins with Johann Adam Schaeffer and ends with my great-grandfather, George Mansfield Sheffer, and covers a time span of approximately 170 years. My talk today will focus heavily on these two family patriarchs of the Sheffer lineage. Johann Adam Schaeffer was born 1751 in what is now Germany in the Baden region, approximately 24 miles from Mannheim, Germany. He was baptized into the German Reformed Church. He lived near the Rhine River and within walking distance of the Black Forest. We know this because the family story says he got caught stealing wood from the Black Forest, and speculation was that this might have influenced his decision to immigrate to America, since only royalty could hunt and gather wood in the king's forest. Life in that part of the world in the mid-1700s was tough. The area was ruled by feudal states, and peasants worked the fields around the castle of the ruling duke or duchess. The population in this area had increased significantly between 1700 and 1750, and farmland became scarce. These conditions drove the migration out of the area. Based on my family's records, I believe Adam Schaeffer began his journey to America in around 1770 when he was 22 years old. The journey to America was difficult. First, you had to get permission to leave the region, and often this required paying a duty to the ruler. Or you took off in the middle of the night. The immigrants boarded riverboats and floated down the Rhine River to Rotterdam. Once the immigrants arrived in Rotterdam, they often waited weeks or months to gain passage on a ship to America. From Rotterdam they sailed to England and then on to America. One ship named Chance we believe to have been the ship Adam boarded for America. It listed 208 passengers on board, 90 men and boys that were over the ages of 16, plus women. Adam relayed to his grandchildren that the ship was 3 months in the crossing, the bread became moldy and the water wormy. Many passengers were sick, and no doubt some died. The ship and its passengers landed in Philadelphia, and Adam migrated across the Allegheny Mountains to Westmoreland County, PA. Why Westmoreland County? Well, I'm not sure. There was an emerging German farming community there, and I suspect he had relatives or friends from the old country who wrote him of the wonderful opportunities that awaited him there. This would have been a typical scenario of the time. Western Pennsylvania in the 1760s was a wilderness. This was Indian land. There were no white people except a few traders. There were no towns, no farmers. Fort Pitt at the headwaters of the Ohio was the only settlement in the region. The Treaty of Fort Stanwix in 1769 opened for the first time settlement land west of the Allegheny Mountains. One wagon trail, called the Forbes Road, traversed the mountains. In 1773, Westmoreland County was carved out of Bedford County, and around that year, Adam Schaeffer made his way to the German settlement in the southwestern Pennsylvania near present-day Greensburg. That same year, Hannahstown was founded as the first English court west of the mountains. As we will see later, Hannahstown was an important meeting place for the recruitment of militia during the Revolutionary War, as Adam Schaeffer's experience dictated in 1778 and 1779. In Adam Schaeffer's Revolutionary War pension application, he stated that he first moved to Westmoreland County, then moved to Fayette County, where he lived for 18 years, then back to Westmoreland County for 30 years before moving north to then Venango County. Searching all the land records, I could only find 2 pieces of property owned by Adam Schaeffer, one in Fayette County and one in Westmoreland County. But clarity will come later to explain why he stated 3 moves but lived in just 2 properties. We know Adam was part of the German pioneer farming life of the region around the time revolution was in the air. In western Pennsylvania, every male 18 years old or older was made part of the colonial militia. At the outbreak of the Revolutionary War, the Iroquois tribe aligned themselves with the British, as did the Seneca tribe, which was located near present-day Warren, Pennsylvania. Raids on the Pennsylvania frontier in 1778 were made by both the Senecas and the Indians of the Ohio country. The raiding parties attacked farms and villages, killing settlers and their livestock, then burning their buildings. Frequently, the Indians took prisoners, particularly women and children, for the purpose of ransom or adoption into the tribe. Blockhouses were built near farm settlements for protection during Indian raids. Adam told his children and grandchildren this experience, documented by his great-grandson in a letter dated 1909. Once while cutting wheat, the Indians attacked him and his neighbors. Adam ran for the wooded fort where the women and children stayed while the men were harvesting their crops. Adam was a small, lightweight man, and a large Indian so nearly overtook him that he expected to be tomahawked. But when the Indian jumped on the fence and he fell, Adam with the other men got into the blockhouse before the Indians overtook them. As the Revolutionary War continued in the East, a decision was made to do something to neutralize the attacks by the Western Indians. In February 1777, General Han, the commander at Fort Pitt, led about 500 militiamen from Westmoreland County, north from Pittsburgh, with a view of capturing a British magazine believed to be at the mouth of the Cuyahoga River, the site of present-day Cleveland. Adam was a militia member in this campaign. The following pension declaration of Adam Schaeffer was given on the 26th of June, 1835, describing his service at this time. He volunteered in the service of the United States in the month of January of the year 1778 in the volunteer company commanded by Christopher Truby, and I met with my company near the place where the town of Greensburg now stands. From thence we were marched to Fort Pitt, 31 miles distance. When we arrived at Fort Pitt, there were several companies there, the whole under the command of General Hand. We remained in Fort Pitt about 2 weeks, and from thence we marched down the Ohio River, crossed the Beaver River, not far from the mouth. From thence we marched to Indian country for the purpose of attacking the Indians in their villages. History has recorded this as the Squaw Campaign. Continuing with Adam's testimony, we were at one Indian town, but the warriors had all left the place and had gone to Cuyahoga, where they were holding council. There were only a few squaws and one warrior in the town. The warrior and 3 squaws were killed by our men, and one was taken prisoner. At this town, 100 of our men were marched in the direction of another town, said to be 10 or 12 miles off. The rest of the troops, among which I was one, were marched back to Fort Pitt, where our company was dismissed, and I returned to my place of residence. Adam served 2 months, the time of which he volunteered for this campaign. The Indian raids intensified on the western frontier, and in order to neutralize this threat, General Washington ordered Colonel Daniel Brodhead to organize and send a force of militia up the Allegheny Valley to neutralize the Indian threat. Again, according to Adam Schaeffer's Revolutionary War pension, he stated the following. In the spring of 1779, I enlisted at Hannistown in the service of the United States again, in the company of Rangers, commanded by Captain Matthew Jack. From there we marched to Fort Pitt, where we were several hundred soldiers, all under the command of Colonel Brodhead. We remained at Fort Pitt 10 or 12 days, then marched up the Allegheny River. At Kittanning we built a fort that was called Fort Armstrong. Adam Schaeffer further stated that we proceeded up the river quite a distance and came to where Warren is now located. It was concluded to leave the baggage and pack horses and cattle. I and about 30 soldiers were left to take care of and guard these wares. The main body was marched some distance for the purpose of destroying an Indian town. They returned in a day or 2, having destroyed the cabins, cornfields, and orchards. The Indians had abandoned their village on our approach. We were then marched back to Fort Pitt and dismissed on September 14, 1779, and during this time we killed 3 Indians and 1 white man who was painted and dressed like an Indian. Upon discharge, I proceeded to my place of residence. Adam served 6 months during this term. This is the present-day site of where the Buckaloo Indian Village was located. The picture to the right is the Allegheny River that borders the village. For Adam Schaeffer's service in the Revolutionary War, he was issued a certificate of pension on the 20th of May, 1835. Adam received semi-annual allowances of $13.33 plus $106 for payment of arrears to the 4th of March, 1835. In 1780, at the age of 29, Adam Schaeffer married Catherine Dorothea Trope Sipe, the widow of Christopher Sipe, who had been killed by the Indians. In total, 7 children were born to the Sheffers between 1781 and 1790. John, my direct descendant, was born in 1774. In 1783, the record shows that they paid taxes on 0 acres, 1 cow, and 0 sheep. In 1785 and 1786, they are listed in Bullskin Township, Fayette County, as owning 86 acres of land and paid taxes of 3.9 and 1 pound respectively. This is the land Adam Schaeffer and Dorothea settled on in 1786, and this is the home that is on Adam's property today. To the right, you can see the map of their property. Now, the answer to the land riddle. The reason Adam lived first in Westmoreland, then Fayette, then Westmoreland again, but only moved once, was because Fayette County was formed out of Westmoreland, and Adam's land then became part of Fayette County. I had a lot of help by a nice lady in Greensburg in order to figure this riddle out. One of our family documents is a 1909 letter written by a great-great-grandson of Adam Schaeffer. It stated that around 1799, Adam and his family moved back to Westmoreland County and lived on a farm located about 2.5 miles northwest from Greensburg on the road to Harrison City. The Indian Spring was said to be on his property. To find this property, my son and I drove 2.5 miles from the center of Greensburg, and there we found a golf course, and lo and behold, on the golf course was the Indian Spring. Eureka! To the right is the Indian Spring that was on Adam's property, and in the background you can see the golf course as it exists today. In 1810, Adam's son John Sheffer married Barbara Best, whose father, William Best Jr., owned land where Greensburg now stands. 5 children were born to the John Sheffers in Westmoreland County between 1814 and 1821. The oldest son, Jacob, was my great-great-grandfather. As families grew up, farmland became scarce. Much like the Amish today, German farm families started looking for areas where land was more available, and eyes moved north towards the newly established Venango County. Around 1810, William Best Sr., Dorothea Best Sheffer's father, purchased a tract of land in newly formed Venango County and gave parcels to each of his children for a relocation to the area. In 1822, John and Barbara made a warrant claim on 199 acres of land from the Holland Land Company in Venango County and moved north to start a new life. The land was completely forested except for several cleared acres. They bought an older log cabin and moved it onto their land and went about building a farm. In Venango County, 5 more children were born to the John Sheffers between 1823 and 1834. Adam Schaeffer Sr. sold his farm in 1828 and moved in with John and Barbara. He died in 1840 at the ripe old age of 89. Besides farming, timber was harvested and floated down the Allegheny River to Pittsburgh to support the city's growth. Flour mills sprung up along the streams, and the iron industry came of age in this region in the late 1820s, when one of the richest metal zones of the time was discovered in the hills of western Pennsylvania. In the spring and fall, when the river was navigable, steamboats would bring finished goods to the region, returning with pig iron for the manufacturing companies in Pittsburgh. By 1850, the furnace operations became unprofitable, and the furnaces shut down. In 1845, Jacob Best Sheffer, my great-great-grandfather, married Sarah Lynn, and they bought and farmed land in the area. The Jacob Sheffers had 11 children between 1846 and 1866. Their second child, George Mansfield Garfield Sheffer, my great-grandfather, was born in 1847. I know very little about Jacob and Sarah Lynn Sheffer, except the fact that they farmed the land. Sarah died in 1890, and Jacob died in 1900, and both are buried in the local cemetery. As little as I know about them, I know quite a lot about my great-grandfather George Mansfield Sheffer. George Mansfield Sheffer grew up on a farm, educated in the country school, and was quite good with horses. He played the piano and the violin, and later in life he would compete in fiddle contests, walking to and from the events. As an adult, according to his military records, GM stood 5 feet 8 inches tall, with dark hair, dark complexion, and gray eyes. In the late 1850s, the great national debate on slavery was smoldering. In 1857, George Mansfield was 10 years old. Discussions around the dinner table in the Sheffer family must have surely included discussions of slavery and the threat of war. However, in 1858, an event that changed the world forever occurred along Oil Creek in northwestern Pennsylvania. Colonel Edwin Drake struck oil on August 27th of that year, demonstrating that large quantities of crude oil could be produced by drilling and launched the modern petroleum industry. The well produced about 20 barrels per day and sold for around $20 a barrel. Speculators quickly followed Drake's example, and by the summer of 1859, wells lined the Oil Creek Valley all the way to the Allegheny River. That same year, Abraham Lincoln was elected President of the United States. On March 4 of 1861, Abraham Lincoln was inaugurated as the 16th President of the United States. And only 5 weeks later, on April 12th, 43 Confederate guns in a ring around Fort Sumter began the bombardment that initiated the bloodiest war in American history. That year, Venango County recruited volunteers for the 4th Pennsylvania Cavalry in Meadville, Pennsylvania, and formed up in Pittsburgh and headed off to war. When the Civil War broke out, the oil drilling in the region virtually stopped. George Mansfield Sheffer and his friends must have talked about the urgency to join the Army of the Potomac and give it to those old rebels. Now, I don't know if his parents approved, but on February 17, 1864, George Mansfield Sheffer and a buddy traveled to Meadville with the intent to sign their names for volunteer enlistment in Company L of the 4th Pennsylvania Cavalry. There was only one problem. You had to be 18 years old to join the Army. George Mansfield and his friend were not yet 17 years of age. In fact, George was only 16 years and 9 months young, 3 months short of his 17th birthday. But they had a plan. They each took off their shoes, wrote 18 on the bottom of their soles, and when the recruiter asked them, "How old are you?" they both answered somewhat truthfully, "Sir, we are both standing on 18. And they were signed in as privates in the 4th Pennsylvania Cavalry. They both enlisted for a term of 3 years and accepted bounties of $78 each. It is interesting what the military officer had to verify in order to administer the oath to the two boys. I certify on honor that I have minutely inspected the volunteer, George Sheffer, previously to his enlistment, and that he was entirely sober when enlisted. And to the best of my judgment and belief, he is of lawful age. And that in accepting him as duly qualified to perform the duties of an able-bodied soldier, I have strictly observed the regulations of which govern the recruiting service. Signed,
Signed,
D.L. Dixon,
D.L.
recruiting
Dixon,
officer.
recruiting officer.
Well, I guess one out
I
of
guess
two of the
one out of
recruiter's
two of the
statements being
recruiter's
true
statements being
isn't too
true
bad.
isn't too bad. The document also stated that this soldier has blue eyes, black hair, dark complexion, and is 5 feet 8 inches tall.
In the month of May, GM reported to Pittsburgh for muster, and then he was stationed at Camp Stoneman in Virginia, located near Washington, D.C. George had his picture taken at the Matthew Brady Photography Studio in Washington and observed the famous Brady clock in the picture. However, Camp Stoneman, like all temporary military camps at the time, lacked sanitary conditions, and because of this, things did not go well for young GM. The following letter, dated June 9, 1864, was sent by his mother while he was stationed at Camp Stoneman in Washington, D.C. Rockland, June 9, 1864. Dearest son, it is with the greatest of pleasure that I have seated myself this evening to write you a few lines to you to let you know that we are all well at present, hoping that these few lines may find you well and all the rest of the days enjoying the same great blessing. I received your letter yesterday and was sorry to hear that you was not well, but I hope that a few lines may find you well again. Has your diarrhea stopped yet? Get some brandy and some black pepper and ginger and use it. We got the money that you had sent home. It had been lying someplace on the way and did not come any sooner. As I have not much to write, I will bring my letter to a close. But remain yours, affectionate mother, Sarah Sheffer. Please write soon, as this comes to hand. On June 19th, he was sent to the Judiciary Square Hospital in Washington, D.C., and then transferred to the Guilsburg Hospital in Maryland. There he was diagnosed with typhoid fever. He was sent home on furlough for 30 days in August of that year to recover, which was extended for another 60 days before he was reported fit by a local doctor to report back for duty in Virginia. He reported back to his unit near Washington, D.C. in late October, early November of 1864. On April 19, 1865, Lee surrendered his army at Appomattox, Virginia. And just 5 days later, on April 14th, as G.M. Sheffer stood watch at a playhouse down the street from Ford's Theater, Lincoln was assassinated. George Manfield Sheffer was discharged from the Army of the Potomac on June 14, 1865, and returned home to his rural home in Venango County. GM and a friend broke down a Springfield infantry rifle they found somewhere, and each brought part of the rifle back home with them. George reassembled it as a keepsake. He also brought home his government-issued binoculars and hat. I do not know if George actually saw combat in his service, but we do know that he told his children that he saw President Lincoln several times, and he admired General Grant, whom he had seen and talked with. He said Grant was as common as Lincoln. In fact, he named his youngest son Ulysses Geary Sheffer in honor of Ulysses S. Grant. In 1921, GM received a letter from a George Gilger that was in response to a letter GM wrote to him. Mr. Gilger's letter tells an amazing story about his experience in the fog of battle. March 15, 1921, from George Gilger to GM Sheffer. I remember distinctly about your ride from Bill Kratzer's shoe shop on Old July. Had you not mentioned it, I would have forgotten all about it. It reminded me, however, of a perilous ride I took on a government horse on the 6th day of February, 1865, at Hatcher's Run, at the left of the Union lines in front of Petersburg, Florida. It was a cool day and cloudy. The night before, the regiment was on picket guarding a crossroad point at Rowdy Crook, while the 2nd Infantry Corps was passing. It rained and sleeted, and the men nearly froze stiff sitting on their horses. The enemy, in the timber near us, kept up a scattering fire all night to let us know they were there, and occasionally they got one of our boys. Well, the next morning, that is on the morning of the 6th, we moved on to Hatcher's Run, and without food or any chance to be warm, were ordered to make a mounted charge on the infantry protected by temporary breastworks. It was a wild affair. The ground was frozen, but not hard enough to bear the weight of our horses, so they broke through and floundered, throwing us in some disorder. We then quickly reformed in platoons of 12 on a road to the left of the open field, where we started. This road was on the edge of timber to our left. The reformation and the continued charge was but one maneuver, and down that road we went with drawn sabers at a dead gallop, cheering wildly as we went. It so happened that I was riding a spirited horse, and out of sympathy for him, I did not have a curb bit in his mouth. So he took his lead, and before I know it, I was in the lead of the column. It transpired also that our friends, the enemy, had prepared to give us a warm reception. Without our knowing it, there was a line of battle concealed in the woods to our left, while we were dashing on the works in our front. Just at the proper moment, when we were where they wanted us, they gave us a volley from the front and from our left that mowed down man and horse and broke up the charge in great confusion. But my excited horse did not stop. He leaped over the breastwork, passed through tree lines of men further on, and turned a curve in the road that brought me face to face with Confederate General Pegram and his staff. By that time, my horse was pretty well winded, so I had no difficulty in obeying the order to halt that was given. To shorten this story, I will say that though I had at least a half dozen or more bullet holes in my clothes, and my cartridge belt was ripped from end to end by a bullet, neither myself nor my horse was scratched. It was in that charge that our old friend Andy McMillan was killed. Many others were either killed or wounded, but I do not recall any others that you know. Jonathan Robart, with me, were paroled on February 18th, just 9 days after we became prisoners. I think this fairly matches the perilous ride you described in your letter. By late 1865, oil was again on the brain of the people of the Venango and Clarion counties. Soon the hills and valleys were dotted with oil derricks. Some wells were bringing in 100 barrels a day. In 1867, the Allegheny Valley Railroad expanded north from Contanning through Emlenton to Oil City. The railroad shipped train tankers of oil to refineries near Pittsburgh, as well as passengers and dry goods back to the oil country. Meanwhile, new wells were being drilled, and if you were lucky, crude poured forth in uncontrollable gushers. The train greatly enhanced the movement of men and supplies to this otherwise isolated section of the state. When new oil strikes occurred, areas went from farmland or small villages with a few buildings to booming, almost out-of-control cities. And when the oil wells ceased performing, the towns and cities virtually disappeared or became ghost towns. The Oil City Derrick newspaper reported that Antwerp City, located near my hometown, was the wickedest town in oildom, where gambling dens flourished with open doors and packed houses. Drunken brawls were an everyday occurrence. The daily barrel yield of crude oil grew exponentially in Clarion County until it peaked in 1876 at 6,000 barrels a day. In 1871, G.M. Sheffer, 26 years old, left the farm and started to work the oil fields, standing tower watch on various oil rigs. When I worked the summers during college at the Emlenton Quaker State Oil Refinery, I heard often that so-and-so had tower watch that night. I really didn't know what that meant, but I knew what they did. The person on tower watch was a night watchman who walked a specified beat around the refinery, making sure that nothing was out of place. Well, that's exactly what George Sheffer was doing more than 100 years earlier, only his watch was at an oil rig. Here are some excerpts from his 1872 Tower watch log. February 19th, 1872. This day I did not work any on account of the engine being broke down. This afternoon went to John Cotterman's and back to Gas City. February 20th. This day I did not work any on account of the engine being broke down. February 21. This afternoon we started up Canning Well number 7 again. The drilling today was very good. We went through the first streak of red rock at about the first sand. On February 22nd, this day I went on tower at 1 o'clock. The drilling today was very hard above the first sand. In the spring of 1774, George Manfield met a lovely young lady that caught his fancy. She had earned a 2-year teaching certificate, and I assume she was teaching school when GM met her. Her name was Sarah Eleanor Myers, daughter of William N. and Jane Armstrong Myers from Nickelville. Over that year they became well acquainted and fell in love. Sarah's 1874-75 diary describes the events that led up to their marriage. She wrote, "On Sunday, November 1874, was at a singing at the Valley Church. George Sheffer came home with me, and then he asked me to be his wife. On January 9, 1875, George went with me to preaching, and I stayed with him till 1:30 o'clock. We were planning our marriage. Saturday, March 27th, George was here. We set the wedding day as the 22nd of April, 1875. On the 28th, he asked father and mother for me. We made our appearance at Pickwick Church. April 21, 1875. The last day of my single life was a beautiful day. I was busy all day fussing for the wedding. April 22nd, my wedding morning, very cloudy. Cloudy all day. Sun shone 3 or 4 times, clouds very still, very little wind. I didn't get scared. Our fair day was a very nice day. It was cloudy sometimes, but not enough to hide the sun. I enjoyed myself first rate. I had a good dinner and came home for dinner the next day." George Mansfield and Sarah Eleanor were married April 22nd, 1875, at her home in Nickelville. They moved 10 miles away to Pickwick and took up housekeeping. GM continued to work the oil field, while at the same time honing his mechanical skills and looking for ways to make the drilling business easier. In 1876, GM applied for a patent for a device used to fish broken drill bits or sucker rods out of a well. The device latched on and secured the tool so that it could be raised out of the well and re-welded like new. Here is a blurb in the Daily Herald newspaper regarding this device. Daily Herald, Edinburgh, Clarion County, PA, Tuesday morning, August 7th, 1877. GM Sheffer of Pickwick is now ready to draw casing with his new patent casing spear. All orders promptly filled. In 1878, GM went into business for himself and formed the Dutch Machine Company in Pickwick, Pennsylvania, doing blacksmithing, straightening and welding drill bits, and general machine repair. Back in those days, everyone had a home remedy for what ailed them, and GM was no exception. In the July 20th, 1878 issue of the Edinburgh Daily Herald, the following paragraph appeared. Mr. George Sheffer of Pickwick has suffered for some years past with some intestine disease, and for the relief of which he has been accustomed to use of a certain oil administered by a syringe. On Wednesday, suffering considerable pain, he resorted to his accustomed remedy. It is supposed now that some poison of some kind had entered into the picture, as immediately after using, bloating commenced, entirely stopping the natural functions. Up to a late hour last night, no relief had been obtained, and the man lies in a critical condition. He was 30 years old. However, it is safe to assume that GM recovered from this sick spell, for he lived for another 60 years. Here is an 1880 advertisement for his services. GM Sheffer, the Dutch Machine Works. General repairing done on short notice. Second-hand engines for sale. Working barrels. Orders by mail or telegraph solicited. Pickwick, Clarion County, PA, 1880. Between 1878 and 1887, the GM Sheffers had 6 children. Their third child, James Austin Garfield Sheffer, was my grandfather. But in the early 1880s, the area's oil fields began to wane, and the Fauksburg-Clarion Railroad closed down, isolating both the small town of Pickwick and the Dutch Machine Works. Therefore, in 1882, the GM Sheffers moved to Emlenton and placed the Emlenton Machine Works into operation. Blacksmithing, general repairing, and machine work was given exclusive attention. GM was 35 years of age. Note the gas street light in the foreground and the gears and junk in front of the shop. The shop had a forge with a bellows and a mechanical hammer used to straighten drill bits to true. Also, notice the road crossing over the railroad tracks to the front of the machine shop. An incident occurred in the 1930s over this crossing that had the railroad detectives looking for GM, but more on that later too. Later, a walk landing was added to the building. Shown here are GM, Sarah, his wife, children Austin, Stella, and Bertha, and his work crew posing for the picture. In November 10, 1885, William Conver and GM Sheffer patented the Daisy engine, and the Daisy Engine Company was organized. R.V. Gilbert and GM Sheffer constituting the company at the time. The patent application was jointly applied by Conver and Sheffer. The device was a rotary engine with a vibrating piston, and was a curiosity in its way, for it was reported that an engine of 15 horsepower would only weigh 550 pounds, for which reason it would be well adapted for use on streetcars. GM was issued 3 more patents for a variety of inventions over the next 20 years. In the late 1800s, a group of local businessmen, oil drillers, and producers formed an oil refining business in Emlenton. In 1890, another group of investors out of Warren, Pennsylvania, bought the company at a sheriff's sale and named it the Emlenton Refining Company. The name Quaker State was first applied in 1915 to a motor oil especially formulated and processed at the Emlenton Refinery for the hot-running air-cooled Franklin automobile. The popular oil soon spread beyond Franklin owners, and the name gained widespread recognition. By 1931, the organization included 19 companies, which were then formed into a single public stock company called Quaker State Oil Refining Corporation. By 1891, the GM Sheffer family was growing up, but the oil repair business was declining. Pictured here left to right are Otis Branfield, GM Sheffer, Bertha, Stella, James Austin Sheffer, Sarah Sheffer, and Plummer Sheffer. Early life tragedy will strike 3 children highlighted in the picture, as we will learn later. In 1892, there was an oil strike in McDonald, Pennsylvania, which is a town 90 miles away and located 30 miles south of Pittsburgh. The western Pennsylvania oil fields were slow, and in order to feed his family, GM, his son James Austin, followed the oil strike to McDonald. They set up another machine and blacksmith shop, while the remainder of the family stayed in Emlenton. The shop, like the one in Emlenton, repaired engines, dressed tools, sold fishing tools for wells, and straightened stems. He called it the Daisy Engine Shop. James Austin, my grandfather, was 12 years old when they left for the McDonald oil fields. My Aunt Eileen wrote, "When my father was 12, grandfather and he went to McDonald, PA, and they stayed for 12 years and had a machine shop there. And as McDonald was having an oil boom, there was work for them. They batched it in McDonald, which, in the jargon of the age, they did their own cooking, which must have been pretty bad. In a letter Austin wrote home to his mother in 1892, he said that after a full day of work, he went to school. "I am going to night school," he said. "Charlie goes too. We pay $1 a month. We have arithmetic, writing, reading, and sometimes we have geography. It starts at 7 and lets out at 9. It is in the public school." Pictured above are Charlie, Austin, and GM. A few months later, the Sheffer's second child, Bertha Florence, age 13, took the train to New Kensington, Pennsylvania, to spend a month with her aunt and uncle, Mr. and Mrs. Ham Watson. On June 1, Bertha wrote a letter to her mother back in Emlenton, kind of scolding her for not writing. New Kensington, PA, June 1st, 1892. Mrs. G.M. Sheffer. "Dear Mama, I thought I would write a few lines to you to let you know that I am well and hope you're the same. Why don't you write? This is the second letter that I have wrote you, and you didn't write me any letters." She went on to tell about a couple of drunks hanging around, and about going to a church picnic and how some boys teased them, as well as listing some French words she was learning from a French-speaking neighbor. 3 days later, on June 4, 1892, at about 1:30 a.m., tragedy struck the Sheffer family. An explosion occurred in the same building where Bertha was an occupant. A piece of glass pierced her throat and killed her instantly. She was 13 years old. A telegram from Mr. Watson to GM in McDonald read, "Your daughter met with an accident in Kensington. Come right away." GM must have found transportation that day to Kensington, for the second telegraph above advises his wife that their daughter, Bertha, is dead. It reads, "Bertha is dead. Think we'll be home on Midnight Express and send word home to Bussy in the afternoon." Signed, GM Sheffer. Yet that day, GM wrote a letter to his wife, perhaps more as a catharsis than thinking the letter would arrive before he arrived on the midnight train. "Dear wife, I take my pen in hand not with pleasure but with sorrow. I just sent you a message that Bertha was dead. There was an explosion in our end of Ham's house, and Bertha was killed instantly from the explosion. Florence was sleeping in bed with her. She was very much shocked, but managed to get out and drag Bertha out, or she would have been burned up. You send word to Ms. Martin to have the hearse go up and see Wellers about a hack so we can take Anna's folks along. I will try and be home on the Midnight Express, and if not, by tomorrow." The coroner's report stated, "Findings of jury came to her death by an explosion on June 4, 1892, about 1:30 a.m. at New Kensington, Westmoreland County, PA. Said explosion was believed was either dynamite or nitroglycerin in the hands of one J.K. Toomer, occupant of the same building in which Bertha Sheffer was sleeping. Whether it was an accident or intentional on the part of said J.K. Toomer, the jury are unable to determine. Bertha Florence Sheffer was buried in the Georgeville Cemetery near the family home." When the wells petered out in McDonald a year later, they shut down the shop and returned home. GM bought Austin a bicycle, the first bicycle to run the streets of town. James Austin Sheffer continued to work in his dad's machine shop, learning skills of the trade while re-entering Emlenton High School. He was a fair student and an athlete, being a member of the 1898 basketball and baseball teams pictured here. When Austin finished the 11th grade, he entered the Tubbs Business College in Emlenton and graduated with the class of 1900 at the age of 20. Of the 23 graduates, most were from the local area, but there were also students from Pittsburgh, Fort Wayne, Indiana, and Hoboken, New Jersey. Tubbs was hosted in a large brick building located appropriately on College Street in Emlenton. The graduation exercise was held June 28th at the Opera House in Emlenton. The program listed the class motto as "Labor Conquers All" and the class colors as crimson and cream. Amazingly, the tiny two-year college offered 3 foreign languages, Greek, Latin, and French, and probably all taught by the same professor. 3 years later, his sister Stella also graduated from the Tubbs Business College, pictured here in a graduation dress photo. It is apparent from these 2 pictures that the college was declining in viability as an institution of higher learning. Stella was 21 when she graduated. By the early 1900s, the old machine shop was virtually falling apart, so a new building was constructed. This one featured iron trusses and cement block walls. The new GM Sheffer machine shop and garage boasted gas and gasoline engines, is completed and open for business. Adam Schaeffer poses in front of the building for the camera. The GM Sheffer machine shop featured a steam-powered line shaft that powered all the machinery, as well as a forge and air hammer used to straighten drilling bits. A large steam boiler made the power for the hammer, and one day, as my Aunt Aline wrote in her memoirs, it got too hot and blew up. It blew across the road and hit the house on the corner. It was fortunate that no one was hurt. Pictured here is Austin and his brother Otis Brandfield at GM's shop. My Aunt Aline wrote, "My grandfather had a machine shop, and he and my father dressed tools for oil wells. The stems, which are used to drill, were about 25 feet long, and during the course of pushing them up into the hole, they often became dull and bent. So my father and grandfather would heat them red hot in the forge, which was made hotter by a bellows, and then the stem was straightened by pounding from the air hammer. Most of the gauging of the straightness of the stem was by eye control." On October 8, 1908, James Austin Sheffer, age 29, married Anna Catherine Klein, age 25. They honeymooned along Lake Erie. Between 1909 and 1921, the Austin Sheffers had 6 children, the first of which was my Aunt Hazel, and the second child was my father, George Elmer Sheffer. In 1909, GM applied for another patent on an invention. This one was for a different type of joint that held railroad rails together. Since the shop was located along the railroad, one can imagine him examining the rail connections and concocting a better way to do it. I have no idea if anything ever came of this patent idea, but I suspect not. And in 1816, GM applied for another patent, this time for some type of device that went on riverboats. Even after trying to read this patent description, I have no idea what it did. The dream of striking it rich in oil was always present. GM's Weiss family, the Myers, never gave up on the dream, and they sought investors within the family. In 1919, Austin invested $650 of badly needed family money with the Myers Drillers, with nothing to report from it but the bitter words, "dry hole." The oil business continued to decline in the 20s, and things got kind of tough for the Sheffers. Yet they were able to take a camping trip or two, as shown here. My Aunt Aline wrote about these times. "We were pretty poor, I guess, but we didn't know it and we were happy. We had popcorn and apples, which were buried in the ground and hurt your teeth to bite into. These were our snacks in the evening. Everyone read, and every dollar we got was used to buy books. Tom Swift and the Rover Boys were favorites. I read everything. Tragedy strikes the Sheffers again. When Plummer Sheffer, Austin's brother, injured his back riding a go-devil, he was confined to a wheelchair. And one day my dad came up from the shop and saw a glow of fire on the window, and Uncle Plummer had set his robe on fire from his pipe. He died in 2 weeks. He was in his 30s. Uncle Otis, another of Austin's brothers, had 2 children, Dorothy and Branfield. Otis was a telegraph operator at the train station and had a bad heart. He died when the children were very small. His wife died 3 years later. The children, Dorothy and Branfield, were left, and Granddad adopted them in order to keep them from going to an orphan's home. Branfield drowned in the Allegheny River near the bridge when he was just 10 years old, and GM lost his business at a sheriff's sale. My Aunt Eileen wrote about their lives at the time. Grandfather did not drink, smoke, or swear, but he could get awful angry. In the 1920s, the oil business kept getting worse and worse. Dad was only making $100 a month, and he couldn't feed and clothe 6 children on that. So he quit working for his dad at the shop and went to work for Quaker State as a machinist. It caused a lot of hard feelings in the family. Eileen continued. I think I mentioned that Granddad was a terror when he got mad. We had a passenger train called the Buffalo Express. It came through Emlenton about 9:30 at night. One night we heard it making all kinds of weird noises, and the next thing someone was at the door wanting to see my dad, who was very close to Granddad. This person at the door said Granddad had a large paintbrush and a can of heavy grease, and he was greasing the rails ahead of the train, and all the train could do was slip and slide. GM was angry at the railroad because they were closing the crossing by the shop, and the horse teams with the stems couldn't come straight up over the railroad crossing to the shop, even though there was little or no work to be done. My dad got him to give up the grease job, and the section gang had to put sand on the tracks so the train could proceed. The railroad detectives came around to investigate, and if it wasn't for the fact that he was a Civil War vet and over 80, they would have probably thrown him in the jug. GM was very patriotic. On the 4th of July, he used to take a cannon he made to the top of the river hill across from the refinery and fire it off in celebration of the founding of our country. He did this until complaints came forth that the concussion from the blast broke out some windows in the town. GM was very active in the GAR, the Grand Army of the Republic, the Civil War Veterans Group. He attended encampments throughout the United States, including a grand gathering at Gettysburg in 1934. As I mentioned earlier, times during the Depression were tough, and on October 1, 1934, GM wrote to Mr. Franklin D. Roosevelt in Washington, D.C. Dear Mr. President, on the 1st of July, 1933, when our pensions were cut 10%, my understanding was that on July 1934 it was to be restored to its original amount, and to this date, in my case, it has not been done. And I presume in many other cases it is the same. On September the 1st, I wrote to the Chief of Pensions Department why the delay in restoring our pensions to its original amount, as the promise was made, and to this date I have not had a reply. My impression is there must be something radically wrong in Washington, D.C., and needs investigating, although I may be wrong. I ought to have my pension increased, as I have 4 people to provide, and I have no other means of support. I tried to get work on the highway at several places, and they all turned me down and said I was too young, they could not hire me, and I am past 87 years young, and I ought to be allowed to work to keep my family from starving. And I am told that there was no age limit mentioned if a man was willing to work. I am not getting enough to pay my grocery bills, coal bills, gas bills, electric bills, and my taxes at the present high cost of living under the Depression. And thanking you for an early reply, which will be greatly appreciated. Sincerely yours, signed, George M. Sheffer. On September 16, 1937, G.M. Sheffer died at the ripe old age of 90. He is buried in the Emlenton Cemetery. During World War II, two of my uncles served in the United States Navy, and my granddad's adopted son, Don Sheffer, joined the Navy at the end of the war when he was 17 years old. My granddad and two of his children worked at the Quaker State Refinery for their entire careers. My father, George Elmer Sheffer, graduated from Penn State College in 1936 and went to work at the Quaker State Oil Refinery in Emlenton and later at St. Mary's, West Virginia. While in St. Mary's, he met my mother, Reva Jane Smith. In 1939, they were married and returned to Emlenton, where Dad continued working at Quaker State for the next 30 years. Between 1942 and 1945, they had two children, George Thomas Sheffer and Richard David Sheffer. Both of us worked at the Quaker State Refinery during summer breaks between college. Dad was a mechanical engineer, a civil engineer, and a professional engineer. He never ran for office, but was elected county surveyor year after year. As kids old enough to swing a brush hook, we trounced over the hills of western Pennsylvania, surveying farms, lots, and city streets with our dad. He would work at the refinery from 7:30 a.m. to 4 p.m., drive down Hill Street to our house across from the school, grab one of us kids and a couple dinner buckets, and head for some mosquito-infested plot of land to survey. We never quit until it was dark, and often ended up holding matches or a flashlight behind a surveying pole for that one last shot. When we returned home, Dad would sequester himself in his den working on map drawings that were due for his last surveying customer. My father died in 1967, and my mother died in 2004. My brother and I both served as officers in the United States Navy. Today, only a scant scattering of German Sheffer clan remains in the western Pennsylvania region, where our extended families live for close to 150 years. I guess one could say that this was the end of one era and the beginning of a new. Thank you for your kind attention to our Sheffer family story.